Last time we talked about an important output of a schedule risk assessment, the risk exposure histogram. If you have not seen that video, we will link it down in the description of this one below. We left off toward the end of that video saying this: if the risk exposure histograms are reporting likely future schedule delays and cost growth, what are the root causes of these potential increases? Today, we will answer that question using a chart that is often used adjacent to the risk exposure histogram, the risk drivers tornado chart. Risk drivers tornado? Let's back up for a moment and explain how we get there, and then how this unique chart is quite useful for both briefing the results of an SRA and then also using it to drive mitigation actions to prevent potentially bad news from the schedule risk assessment from becoming reality. The creation of this chart thrives on two primary types of risk inputs. Number one, duration and/or cost uncertainty inputs. Typically, these are 3-point duration estimates or cost estimates. For example, for duration, if a task is scheduled to take about 20 days, then the minimum duration of the task might be input as 18 days, most likely 20 days, and then maybe 25 or 30 maximum days. If the schedule were just a few tasks, you could do the math in your head to forecast the likely outcomes of the project. But on real projects with hundreds or even thousands of tasks, a Monte Carlo simulation helps to determine all of the likely outcomes. The next key input is the project's risk register, and really at two levels. The first level is identifying and documenting potential threats and opportunities to project execution. In contrast to the uncertainty assessments we talked about a minute ago, these threats and opportunities have names. Risk of inadequately maintained equipment, risk of shipping delays, risk of inadequate available resources for highly technical work. Anything that you can put a name on that can get between your project and successful execution. The second level is mapping these threats directly to the areas of the plan that they are most likely to impact. This can take some time, but when we run the risk exposure histogram, the information will be more targeted and actionable. It's not always difficult. We'll map the risk of inadequately maintained equipment to the areas of the plan that involve heavy equipment. Risk of shipping delays, mapped to areas of the plan where we're buying things and shipping them around. Doesn't need to be complicated. Shouldn't be complicated. Ultimately, the risk simulation and the risk drivers tornado will help us determine which risks stand to drive the most impact so that we can get on with prioritizing mitigation strategies. Now, when all those inputs are set, uncertainty in the risk register and the mappings, preferably we do this early in project execution or even prior. We'll then run the risk simulation, today in Acumen Risk, and check the results. First, you'll see the risk exposure histogram. And again, in that last video linked below, we talk about the ins and outs of that chart. Now on to the new one today, the risk drivers tornado. The initial view shows activities down the left-hand side y-axis. These are ranked by the expected impact to the project. It's fairly easy to understand. The activities sorted to the top of the list have the most expected impact to execution due to risk and uncertainty. These segments on the bars to the right break out the driving factors behind the anticipated delay. This is exactly why we spent time assessing uncertainty and then defining and mapping risk register risks. Now we can see which of those items truly stand to impact us the most and on which activities the delay will be experienced the most. There is another view, which is potentially even more useful when it comes to prioritizing risk mitigation. By clicking this button up here in Acumen Risk, we rotate the chart so that the project threats are now on the left-hand side y-axis, and the sort is by the expected impact of each named threat, along with a line for uncertainty when its impact is among those top named threats. The reason why this view is so important is because if there's some way to mitigate or otherwise avoid the threats from the top to the bottom and risk recovery is achieved, the project may be very likely to finish on time. However, if these risks are left unaddressed and they've been accurately assessed, they are very likely to prevent the project from finishing on time. By producing this chart, this particular view of the tornado chart, the project risk analyst is showing the team a version of the future where things can and perhaps will go wrong. These items identified by the team itself. The analyst and the report are not saying, though, that the project is doomed for failure. Rather, by looking at how things can go if risk is not addressed, this helps us emphasize the importance of proper risk management and risk mitigation. While the risk drivers tornado is just one of many charts, graphs, and reports that can come from a schedule or cost risk assessment, it's arguably the most useful when it comes to lining up the top threats to execution and then knocking them down with clever mitigation and avoidance strategies.